The horrors this weapon created were something Maxim himself couldn't even imagine in his wildest dreams. But he lived just long enough to see his own design help create the most horrific form of combat ever seen in our history. He lived to see over 57,000 British soldiers mowed down on the first morning of the Somme. He died 6 days after the offensive ended. However, his weapon kept sowing death for 2 more years. So, you're now going to see how all that happened. Let's start with a guy called Sir Hiram Maxim. He was born in the United States, and although he had no formal engineering education, he started playing with various designs and creations already as a little kid. And as he grew older, he went into electricity. But anyway, to make a long story short, he went to London, where he eventually went into working with guns after his friend allegedly told him that if he wanted to make a pile of money, he should invent something that will, quote, enable these Europeans to cut each other's throats with greater facility. So, he was working on a new weapon, pretty much by himself, and built an automatic gun. There's a story going around how when he was a little kid, he fired a rifle and the recoil knocked him off his feet, which planted the seed in his mind that this recoil energy could be harnessed. Now, what made this thing actually work was Maxim's brilliant idea of using that recoil energy to operate the gun automatically. He started experimenting on a Winchester rifle, where he rigged up a lever that used the recoil to work the rifle's action, and from there, he kept refining the idea until he had what he wanted. Between 1883 and 1885, he patented all 3 of the basic methods of operating an automatic gun: gas, recoil, and blowback. Pretty much every automatic firearm in the world today still uses one of those 3 principles, and Maxim invented all of them. He set up shop in London, in a place called Hatton Garden, and that's where he built his first prototype, which he demonstrated to invited guests. The Maxim worked on the recoil principle. When you fire a round, the barrel and the breech are firmly locked together by something Maxim designed called a toggle lock, which is essentially 2 arms hinged together like your knee, locked straight at the moment the gun fires. The recoil drives both the barrel and the breech backward together, and after about 11 millimeters of travel, by which point the bullet has long left the barrel and the gas pressure has dropped, a cam pushes on the toggle and breaks it, just like bending your knee. Now the breech keeps moving backward while the barrel stops. The spent cartridge gets pulled out and ejected, and a lever Maxim called the accelerator transfers the leftover energy to slam the bolt back against a heavy return spring. The spring then snaps everything forward again, stripping the next cartridge out of the belt, chambering it, and locking the toggle straight again, ready for the next shot. The whole cycle takes a fraction of a second, and the gun keeps doing this for as long as you hold the trigger down and the ammunition keeps feeding. Maxim himself liked to compare it to a steam engine, where the gunpowder was the steam, the trigger was the valve, and the breech block was the piston. The thing had 280 interchangeable parts and was a genuine mechanical marvel for its time. He envisioned this as a weapon for sustained fire that could mow down whole formations of enemy infantry. So, instead of feeding the gun from a magazine on top, like every other rapid-fire weapon of the time did, he fed it from a 250-round canvas belt. And to keep the barrel from burning out under sustained fire, since you'd be putting hundreds of rounds through it without a break, he wrapped the barrel in a metal jacket filled with water, which absorbed the heat and kept the barrel from melting. After about 600 rounds, though, the water reached boiling point and started giving off a steam plume, which was a great way to advertise your position to the enemy. So, Maxim ran a hose from the jacket down to a condenser can on the ground, where the steam would condense back into water that could then be poured back into the jacket. Pretty clever solution. There was one more problem with the early Maxim, though, and that was the powder. Black powder, which is what every firearm of the time used, burns very dirty. Every time you fired the gun, it threw out a huge cloud of white smoke that hung in the air and gave away your position even worse than the steam plume did. So Maxim worked together with his brother Hudson on developing a smokeless powder to solve this, combining nitroglycerin, gun cotton, and castor oil as a binder, and what they came up with became the first cordite. Once the gun was running on smokeless powder, it could finally be used in concealment, and that's when it became the truly deadly weapon it would soon prove to be. Although Maxim and his brother never spoke again after coming up with smokeless powder, as they fought over the patent for years afterward. So then Maxim showed this thing to the public when nothing like that existed in the world. There was a Gatling gun, but it was hand-cranked, too bulky, and just not remotely close to the performance of the Maxim, which was the first true automatic firearm. A single weapon manned by 4 men that would replace the whole company of riflemen. So Maxim now had this revolutionary weapon in his hands, and he needed to sell it. He'd founded the Maxim gun company back in 1884 with financial backing from Albert Vickers, and now he started touring around Europe demonstrating the gun to anyone who would watch. By 1888, the British had ordered 120 of them, and they quickly adopted the gun. But every major power also wanted one, and they all bought into the Maxim's design in their own calibers and variations. The British, for example, made theirs in .303, the Germans in their 7.9 2mm Mauser, the Russians in 7.62 by 54, and so on. By 1912, the British had Vickers redesign the original Maxim into a lighter, simpler version, and that became the Vickers gun, which would serve the British Army all the way until 1968. So now you had Maxims and Maxim derivatives in pretty much every major army on Earth, all based on the same design Hiram Maxim had patented back in the early 1880s. But here's the strange thing. For all the buying and licensing and producing, none of these guns had really been tested in a serious battle between modern armies. There had been some demos, some trials, some colonial police actions, but nothing that put the weapon to a real test against a serious enemy. Until that day came. Well, that first combat use came in 1893, when the British were fighting a colonial war in Africa. About 700 British troops equipped with 5 Maxim guns were attacked by a force of somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 Ndebele warriors that came charging straight at them. The Maxims opened up and, quote, mowed them down like grass, causing about 1,500 casualties, with only 4 British soldiers killed in return. The same thing happened again a week later, where the Maxims cut down some 2,500 warriors charging at them across open ground. But military commanders looking at all this were not really impressed, because these fights were against tribal warriors, armed pretty much with spears and swords, charging at a machine gun. They all thought something like that could never happen to a modern European army. However, it should have scared them, because for some strange reason, the most modern armies would very soon use the very same tactics as those tribes. Then came the Russo-Japanese War in 1904. It was the full-dress preview of the Western Front, and it was largely misread by the powers that watched it. At Port Arthur, the Russian garrison fielded an early pattern Russian Maxim, and well, the casualties tell the story. The Japanese had about 15,000 men killed or wounded in 6 days of frontal charges, with between a third and half of all those casualties caused by machine guns. The European powers sent observers to look at this war of trenches, barbed wire, and artillery for the first time, which should have been a massive red flag and warning to them about what happens when modern technology is deployed on this kind of scale, and then fought with the old tactics. And you know what they concluded? That the machine gun was overrated, and that rifle, bayonet, and charge were the real war-winning formula. They thought the Russian and Japanese armies were simply incompetent and outdated, and that this whole trench-style siege fighting could never happen in Europe, where commanders are well-educated and know what they're doing. You already see where it's going. It was now August 1914. World War I had just begun. And guess what? All the major armies were producing somewhere between 100 and 200 machine guns per month in their preparations for the war, since the thing was genuinely seen as overrated. Well, that non-revolutionary, overrated weapons production jumped pretty quickly to over 10,000 per month, as the war they thought would end in weeks, dragged on into the worst form of combat we've seen in history. So when the war began, nobody, and I really mean nobody, thought it was going to last more than a few weeks, maybe a few months at most. But somehow, it turned into 470 miles of trenches, stretching from the Swiss border all the way to the English Channel, with millions of men packed into mud, barbed wire, and shell holes for 4 years straight. And it's fair to say that the Maxim had quite a lot to do with this. So, here's what happened. In the opening weeks of the war, both sides were still using the tactics they had been training with for decades, which means massed infantry advancing in dense formations with artillery support. The same kind of tactics that had won wars in the 19th century. But what they ran into was quick-firing artillery, modern bolt-action rifles, and most of all, the machine gun. The Maxim and its derivatives were sitting on both sides of every battlefield, mowing down anyone who tried to cross open ground in formation, just like they had at Port Arthur, just like they had against the tribesmen in Africa, except now it was professional European soldiers being mowed down. Who could expect that? A few months deep into the war, both sides started realizing that standing up in the open was basically a death sentence. By the end of 1914, the front had stabilized into one continuous line of trenches, and neither side could find a way to break through. And the reason they couldn't break through was, in large part, the machine gun. Every time anyone tried to attack across no man's land, the machine guns on the other side would catch them in the open and mow them down. Now, as the front solidified through 1915, the way machine guns were used started to change. They stopped being just a defensive weapon you set up on a parapet and started becoming the absolute backbone of the entire trench system. Whole sections of the line were built around them, and despite looking like random trenches and wire bunched up wherever, they were actually designed to maximize what the machine gun could do. The rest of the defenses, the wire, the trenches, the artillery, were all arranged to feed targets into the machine gun's killing area. So, when the line fully settled, machine guns became strong points that nobody really had the right way to deal with. But, to understand why, you need to see where the majority of the horrors of the Western Front really come from. Bear with me for a moment. When a machine gun fires a burst, the bullets don't all follow the exact same path. Tiny vibrations in the gun, slight differences in each cartridge, the gunner's grip, all of these mean that every bullet leaves the barrel at a slightly different angle. So instead of going to one single point, the bullets spread out in a cone shape from the muzzle, getting wider the further they travel. That's called the cone of fire. Now, where this cone hits the ground, you get an oval-shaped area where the bullets actually land, and that's called the beaten zone. The width of the beaten zone stays about the same at any range, but the length of it depends on the terrain. On flat ground, sloping away from the gun, the ellipse is long. On rising ground or at close range, it's shorter. Now, here's where it gets really nasty. If you aim the gun low and flat, so that the center of the cone of fire stays no higher than about a man's chest all the way out to the target, that's called grazing fire. On level terrain, you can get up to about 700 meters of continuous grazing fire. And what that means in practice is that for that entire 700 meters, anyone standing upright is in the bullet's path the whole way. So, if a wave of attackers walks into that 700-meter strip, every single man in it has a good chance of getting hit. Then there's enfilade fire, and this is the absolute killer. Enfilade fire is when the long axis of your beaten zone, that long ellipse, lines up with the long axis of the enemy formation. So, imagine attackers coming at you in a single row, shoulder to shoulder. If you fire at them from the front, only the men directly in front of your gun get caught in the beaten zone. But if you can fire at them from the side, so that your beaten zone runs down the entire length of their line, now every single man in that line is inside your beaten zone, all at once. A frontal burst catches a few men. An enfilade burst can catch a whole company in one go. This is why the angle a machine gun was placed at mattered so much, and why the deadliest positions were always the ones that could shoot across the front of an attack rather than straight at it. Then you take all of this and combine it with what's called interlocking fields of fire. You arrange several machine guns so that the beaten zones of all the guns overlap or fit together. So, even if attackers find a spot of dead ground hidden from one gun, they get caught by another one shooting from a different angle. The whole frontage of the trench line is always covered, and always covered from at least one angle that produces enfilade fire. There's nowhere to hide in this killing zone, and this is where the Germans got really clever. Instead of putting their machine guns on top of the hill, on the crest where you'd expect them to be, they placed them just behind the crest, on the reverse slope, or tucked into folds of ground where they couldn't be seen. This is called defilade and reverse slope sighting. A gun on the crest is silhouetted against the sky, easy to spot, and easy for enemy artillery to range in on and destroy. A gun behind the crest, however, is invisible from the front. The artillery can't see it, and the only way to get to it is to come over the top of the hill, at which point you're standing in the gun's sights. Wire belts were laid deep, 20 to 40 meters across, to hold the attacker as long as possible inside the beaten zone. Then there was what the Germans called the reinforced concrete crew shelter, which the British nicknamed the pill box, after the small containers that medicine pills came in, with walls and roof of reinforced concrete several feet thick. These started appearing in late 1916. The British rarely built them, officially because, quote, such works were not worth the labor or the cost. Every gun position was also supported by multiple alternate emplacements and dummy loopholes connected by covered crawl trenches. Then, there was indirect machine gun fire, which is the technique of dropping bullets onto unseen targets in dead ground beyond ridges. You needed at least 4 guns to overlap their beaten zones into a usable killing area. The targets were crossroads, communication trenches, supply paths, forming up areas, and so on. The most spectacular sustained Vickers action of the entire war took place at High Wood on the Somme. 10 Vickers, 12 hours of continuous fire, around 1 million rounds. with urine poured into the water jackets when the water ran out. Now, both the round count and the claim that around 100 barrels were changed during that action may be a little inflated, but what's solidly established is that they fired for 12 hours straight, used all their water, and then had to use urine. The infantry attack itself actually failed, but that machine gun barrage held back German reinforcements. Now, every machine gun position was a small logistical operation. Crews of 4 to 6 men manned the gun, sometimes up to 8 when you count ammunition carriers and the NCO. And you'd need men because all the Maxim derivatives and everything that goes around them were not exactly light to carry around. The MG08 alone weighed about 26 kilograms, or 58 pounds, with a full water jacket. Add the sled, and the combat weight was roughly 62 kilograms, or about 140 pounds, even more with the shield and accessories. All crews used condensing cans to suppress the steam plume. Each section carried at least one belt-filling machine, because filling belts by hand was too slow and would cause feed jams. Standard doctrine on all sides by 1915 was to fire short bursts from alternate emplacements and then shift positions after the gun's location was disclosed. A single machine gun was deployed with a primary position plus 1 to 3 alternates. When their position was compromised, they had to disassemble the whole gun setup, carry everything to the next position, set it up there, and continue firing. The man behind the gun was, not surprisingly, the most sought-after target on the front, and he sat in a fixed position, firing a weapon that was impossible to hide for long, so every artillery observer, sniper, mortar crew, anyone in range wasn't going to take long to find him. The widely quoted figure is that Western Front machine gunners had a life expectancy of around 10 hours of firing time. Although snipers were usually trying to shoot the water jacket to disable the gun instead of killing the gunner, who'd immediately be replaced by the next poor soul anyway. The German army from 1916 onwards issued trench armor specifically to its sentries and machine gun crews, while the MG08 itself carried a small armored shield, to give the crews at least some protection, or at least a feeling of being a bit safer. Now, the machine gunner's specific horror wasn't really the same as the rifleman's. Over hours of firing, he watched the bodies pile up in front of his position, all the men he himself had killed. And because of the one man causing all that horror, there was the widespread custom of killing captured machine gunners when they tried to surrender, and usually not by shooting them, if you know what I mean. This is one of the documented atrocities of the trench war, and it was seen quite a lot on all sides. There was rage at the casualties just inflicted, and distrust of gunners who fired to the last possible moment and then threw up their hands when the attacker was already at the parapet. Anyhow, the British went to war with each battalion having only 2 of these quote-unquote overrated Vickers or Maxim guns. That soon went to 4, but then they created the Machine Gun Corps, pulling all the heavy machine guns out of the battalions and grouping them into specialist units, while battalions kept the lighter Lewis gun for close support. The Machine Gun Corps eventually had 170,500 men, and due to the nature of their job that you just heard about, they took over 62,000 casualties, 12,498 of them being killed. This is how the Corps earned the nickname the Suicide Club. The Maxim family also lived a parallel air-cooled life as the standard fighter armament of the war. On the Vickers aircraft gun, for example, the water jacket was stripped off and replaced with a louvered barrel shroud, cooled by the slipstream. And because it fired from a closed bolt, it was easier to synchronize with the propeller timing for shooting through the propeller arc without shooting down your own plane. The German equivalent was the IMG-08 and the air-cooled IMG-08/15, called the Spandau, with a perforated cooling jacket. As for Sir Hiram Maxim, he died on the 24th of November, 1916, at the age of 76, 2 years short of the armistice, and just 6 days after the official close of the Battle of the Somme. He lived long enough to see the offensive in which his German licensees' MG08s had caused 57,470 British casualties on the first morning alone. The water-cooled Maxim had won the defensive war, but it simply wasn't useful for fighting any other kind due to its weight. So the water-cooled design would get replaced by the new air-cooled machine guns that would haunt the soldiers of the next global war. So if you've made it this far, and like what we're doing, tell us what you'd like to see next, or go check out more such videos on our channel. See you in the next one.